welcome everybody. The audience is somewhat diverse from the invitations and the registrations we've had and from looking who's actually dialed in here. But our Retirement ACE, the Retirement Advisor Circle of Excellence, as the A implies, this is primarily designed for advisors, but we have people that are record keeper wholesalers, DCIO wholesalers, and other industry influencers, well-known folks on the call. And we're glad you're here. We're thankful you're participating. We want your feedback, and we're hoping that you will spread the word on what we're trying to accomplish here. Now, very, very important, I want to do a Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. We very much want your feedback. We had a number of polling questions for our dress rehearsals, and the polling questions throughout the presentation we dropped. We've got them kind of as slides for you to think of, but at the end, we need a couple minutes of your time to answer some polling questions, and we're doing that in lieu of sending you a survey, which we know how surveys work, right? You send them out to 1,000 people, and hopefully 2 or 3 will respond to them. So we're hoping to catch you real time here and give us just 2 or 3 minutes to quickly answer these survey questions on how we can best serve you, how we can best serve the community. So today is a primer for you all, a sample, if you will. But here's the agenda. We're going to talk about what Retirement ACE is. We started out with some teasers on LinkedIn, and it worked pretty well because we had a lot of you saying, hey, what's this all about? Tell me what's going on with Retirement ACE. And thank you, everybody, for your time and your interest. And it's just not a primer, just not a teaser. Mike and I have spent a lot of time, along with Bill, to put an agenda together to you in presentations that we really, really, truly have poured some effort into, hope that it's valuable for you. So a little background on who we are. I'll do the first part of the curriculum on fiduciary best practices. What are best practices in advisors pricing your services, and you as advisors pricing record-keeping services on behalf of your clients. Mike will talk about business operation and client segmentation, and we'll get into a little more about that. And we'll wrap up with what's next, how to get more information on Retirement ACE, and where we're going from there. So let me start out with, please use the Q&A feature, and that's in addition to your heckling, okay? Bill Chetney has been with us along the way, and many of you know him, some of you don't, but please look into what Viking Cove does, and we're happy to be partnering with Viking Cove and Bill Chetney on this, but he's our moderator for today for Q&A, and he'll decide, should we wait till the end, do those Q&A features as we go along, but please do that. And Bill, thank you for your time and what you've done for us so far and helping us with the broadcast today. So I mentioned the intro to the early birds. A lot of you that are familiar with the gray hair that Mike and I bring to this industry, okay? But one of our goals is, and the way this started is, I was going to do my own mastermind group, right? I was going to train and mentor some advisors, and whether that was local in Dallas or across the country doing it Zoom, but it was an idea that launched probably 6 months ago. And Mike and I just talked a little bit more about where we've been, what we've done, and what we hope to share with you all, regardless of your experience, right? And so 60 years, over 60 years experience between the two of us, and over 24 ERISA class action lawsuits. And we really want to share with you things that we've seen how the sausage gets made. All right, we're bound by confidentiality agreements, but it just means we can't talk about the specifics of individual cases. We can talk to you about what we've seen and what we've learned, and that's really what we want to bring to you. So Mike's curriculum throughout Retirement ACE, both today and ongoing, is based on his strength and his experience of business operation. And let's be clear that it's okay to be profitable in this business. It's okay to make money, right? As you read some of these class action lawsuits, you would think that all the attorneys are out to just trim fees, but as long as we're delivering value, it's appropriate. I can say this, in the middle of one of my depositions, I was pressed very hard by opposing counsel, and I gave a response that said, hey, just so you're aware, until we're all in this for charities, there's going to be revenue that's made, and if service is delivered, that revenue is deserved to be had. But Many of you people in this call are very, very good advisors. And I don't mean to say you're not great business people, but there are plenty of advisors out there who know ERISA, but could use some help on business operation. And that's where Mike comes into play. My experience has been more client facing and more what is better service delivery. So that's kind of what our difference in delivery will be. So with that, I'm going to have Mike give you a little bit of background on where we've been and where we want to go and what retirement age is all about. Mike.
Sure. As Eric discussed, he was looking at doing such a mastermind group as I was as well. And so we came together. We've worked together in the past and it's been successful. So we figured we'd come together again. But with this, Retirement Circle of Excellence. This is about building community, curriculum, and collaboration across the retirement advisor community. And that is from the standpoint of wealth management as well as 401k plans. Now, our format is we're planning on doing 2 sessions a month. And the first session will be around curriculum, which is based off of fiduciary and practice management. The second session will be around brainstorming and us leading brainstorming as well as driving topics from the community. With that, we'll have a monthly newsletter. We'll have different guests from different subject matter expertise and topics in the industry, from everything from cybersecurity to platforms and so on. With that, we are also looking at a potential certification through a university, which would be given to the group as well. And we are looking at our other partners and bringing them into play, such as Viking Cove. But with this, as we go through questions, some of these questions at the end will be from survey from your standpoint of how you would like to see this run as being a part of the community, what you would like to see, how would you like it to operate? Eric?
All right, with that, we will move on to the first part of our curriculum, and this is fiduciary best practices. And today's topic is pricing advisor services and pricing of record-keeping services. And a lot of this is lessons learned from class action. So just for this particular module, I start out pricing of advisor services. Do you do it on a flat fee basis or an asset base? And what is the fiduciary impact to the plan sponsor and the individual participant? And then it looks almost like a duplicate, but to the right, pricing of record keeper services. The same question, your choice of flat fee, and when I say your choice as an advisor, it's obviously the plan sponsor's choice, but you're the ones making the recommendation and driving that. What's the fiduciary impact to the plan sponsor and to the individual participant? And we'll talk about benchmarking and RFP best practices and kind of as it relates to pricing. And then I'm going to address DOL guidance on how plan fees are assessed to participants. And when I say assessed, obviously if plan sponsor is cutting a check for some of these things, then that would not apply. But this is when payment for third-party services come out of the plan. So one of my goals for the advisors or everybody on this call is I'd like you to come up with 1 or 2 and maybe 3, but specific action items. Mike and I have a number of topics we're going to bring over, and certainly we hope you're taking notes, saying, hey, here's where we can have a discussion for our team or maybe with a client, but 1 or 2 very specific items. And here's one of the phrases I've been using over and over. I had a lunch keynote today, and that was a group of plan sponsors. We had about 40 plan sponsors in a room. And I gave them this specific goal, and I'm using this phrase, be more than a fiduciary. Don Trone, hopefully this is making you a little teary-eyed, okay? But picture this in a spectrum, and let me start out with an example of math, right? When a young child is going to kindergarten, we hope they can count to a certain number, right? And then you get to 3rd grade and you're learning arithmetic. Then we get to junior high school and it becomes algebra, then it turns into geometry, then calculus, and then it gets to the point that I say it's no longer math, when it's just Greek symbols and differential equations, and they have matrices and right things that but picture that as a left to right continuum, right? You don't do geometry before you've done algebra, before you've done arithmetic. And I promise to elaborate on that, but on the left-hand side, what are the ERISA fiduciary obligations? What's the minimum legal requirements? All right, and this phrase I have, be more than a fiduciary, my message during class, my keynote this morning and to you all here is, be a better steward. Where you could say, well, Eric, aren't fiduciary and steward essentially the same thing? Well, here's how we distinguish this. In the defined contribution space, you can meet all of your fiduciary obligations and still have lousy participant outcomes. Okay, so let me set that aside. Defined benefit space, you cannot do that, right? And just to address that, you do have to define an outcome in the defined benefit space, whether it's a promised income for life and a formula for defined benefit, that is a requirement. But where most of us are operating these days, right? And I recognize some of you have a defined benefit practice, but you can meet all your fiduciary obligations and nobody enrolls in the plan. You can meet your fiduciary obligations and there are lousy deferral rates, right? We can meet the fiduciary obligations and not make an impact. And then the fiduciary standard of care is where, you know, a committee actually takes action. Best practices is as it's defined best practices. But I want you to look at this continuum. Stewardship is you focus on fiduciary best practices and favorable participant outcomes. We have participants with too many loans. How do we fix this? We have participants that need to learn more about target date funds. How do we fix this? And then at the end of the spectrum, what we're hoping to help you out with Retirement ACE is you actually have a structure that resembles behavioral governance. It's the highest standard, which includes a framework of leadership, stewardship, and governance. So that's one of my global goals for you. But let's kind of move on to, and here's what I mentioned. Hey, these were going to be polling questions, but I want you to ask yourself as an advisor, how do you prefer, okay, not how does this work, but do you prefer to bill your clients, and better to say charge your clients, your service agreement? Is it an asset-based arrangement? Is it a flat fee, which you can include a cost of living arrangement? Or you don't have any preference, right? You can tell the client however you want to do this. And I recognize, let's look at what I said. How do you prefer? And I'm sure you're going to tell the client, hey, however you want to do this, but what is your preference? And just figure out what that is. And now let's look at the overriding principle. I say this in all my keynotes. The single simplest way for plan fiduciaries to mitigate risk is to pay for all third-party service providers by the employer. Write a check for record keeping, write a check for the advisor, write a check for your auditor, write a check for communication material, write a check for your ERISA attorney, right? Number one simplest way, and I tell them, hey, I recognize that I just spent your money, but I compare that to healthcare costs. So as I get into this topic of how are we charging for advisor fees and record keeping fees, remember that it almost doesn't matter if the plan sponsor cuts a check. I say almost because you still want to be a good business person and you do have to look at service. Most straightforward answer I have ever gotten out of a DOL examiner. This was at a public event, raised my hand in the crowd and I said, if a plan sponsor, the employer, writes a check for record keeping and they are overpaying, do you care? He answered right away, as straightforward as get, by definition, I do not care because it does not impact the plan participant. Okay, so now let's go over kind of what the core topic is for curriculum here. How to price your services as a plan as an advisor. Now, everything I talk about really does apply to the small market, right? We've got a lot of these state mandates and some of you as advisors and some advisors are kind of making that part of their business. And I know Bill Chetney and Viking Cove have some great tools to help you out with that. And I want to address that. I don't want to say it's an exception because it's really not an exception. Many advisors have, hey, here is our minimum fee. Our minimum fee is $5,000. Our minimum fee is $10,000. This is the service we provide, and this is what we need to be compensated for. So in essence, that's a choice to do a flat fee. Some other advisors for startups, right, they're counting on other things, and they will do it on an asset-based fee. But I understand in the small and micro market, there could be different considerations. So with that, we'll just talk about the advantages, disadvantages of each of these arrangements. Most of you probably already think, oh, I know the advantages and disadvantages, but I'm going to approach this from a fiduciary standpoint. how does this impact the plan participant? So obviously in an asset-based fee arrangement, if the plan grows by 20%, your revenue increases by 20%. The question is, are you providing 20% more value? Are you giving 20% more value to the plan sponsor and the plan participants? And that's when I have something highlighted and in bold and in a different color and underlined, that's the key there, all right? When do you take a pay cut? Right, if you're charging whatever the number is, 20 basis points, 30 basis points, and that plan continues to grow and you as an advisor, your revenue grows, over time, you're gonna have to come back to the plan sponsor and say, we're gonna go from 30 basis points to 25 basis points. Hopefully everybody in this call, since you're spending the time to tune in and learn a little bit, you understand that, but I'm sure you know there are plenty of advisors that don't do that. I'm engaged with a client right now that I told, this is the words I use to my clients, and I don't know if everybody knows or not, I'm no longer licensed, so I'm just doing consulting work, but I said, your advisor is getting paid 3 times what the normal going rate is. And I said, if you want to pay them that rate continuing going forward, I will quit what I'm doing, I will go get my licenses, and I will sit in your office 3 days a week and be your advisor. That's how much you are overpaying them. This advisor never took a pay cut. Now, here's something, advisors, that I think for your stewardship reports, how much you're making, your clients, if you approach this with, not how am I going to get a pay raise, but what if you deserved a pay raise? You have a client that had 2, 3 acquisitions, right? And it was a flat fee, or however it is, if you document what you're providing and everything in here, and when you deserve the pay raise, you could willingly and knowingly and confidently go to your client and say, hey, we think we deserve a pay raise, and this is why. So if the market recedes, plan assets decrease, how are you going to ask for a pay raise if you really deserve it? Okay, for flat fee arrangements, hopefully you can tell I'm a fan of that. Your revenue is more predictable and their cost is more predictable. A 20% increase in planned growth does not involve 20% more work, and a 20% drop in asset does not mean a 20% pay cut, all right? And it is much easier to have the dialogue with the plan sponsor that they are meeting their fiduciary obligations to monitor you. It's easier for them to do with a flat fee arrangement. Now, just to be clear, am I saying it's wrong to asset-based pricing? Absolutely not. Right? If you go to Field Assistance Bulletin 2003-03, which we'll talk about a little more, it says the DOL gives plan sponsors considerable discretion on how they pay for services. Okay. How do you benchmark your fees and service? How often are you doing that? And you as advisors need to own that. And if you do, you won't get surprised. How often does a plan need to do an RFP for advisor services? And you need to think about, if you're telling your clients you need to do an RFP for record keeping services every 3 to 5 years, and we'll talk about more about where that comes from. You're telling them they need to do an RFP for record keeping services and benchmarks. Consider how that goes when they talk about your service. So next question, record keeping pricing. How do you prefer the record keeping be priced for your client? You want it to be a flat dollar amount? Do you want it to be an asset-based amount? Or you have no preference? But before I move on, I want to give, let's call it disclaimers here, okay? There are very capable, very reputable national firms who perhaps in a segment of their record-keeping service, right, different platform arrangements, they only do an asset-based fee pricing. Or, I know there are some, they're very reputable, they do a great job in that segment. But on the flip side, there are some also that only do a flat fee arrangement, right? So just to preview that, I think as advisors, you need to address that. The plan sponsor needs to say, hey, should we shift from an asset-based record-keeping fee arrangement to a per-head arrangement? Oh, our record keeper is X and they only do it on an asset-based fee. Okay, we're otherwise satisfied with them, so we're comfortable with the pricing. But here's what I want you to get at for how you prefer record-keeping services to be priced from a fiduciary standpoint. Let's look at this on how you are benchmarking. As advisors, how are you benchmarking record-keeping services And how do most of the benchmarking services show this? All right, so what I've got here is a chart, and I'll walk you through it. Obviously, a lot of numbers, a lot of figures, but the figures are to tell a story. It's not essential that you memorize this whole chart. But what I've got here, and the years don't matter, it's just basically 6 years of growth in a plan. But let's just start with this one plan. Let's go over the first row, year 2020. We have a plan with 5,000 participants, $300 million in assets, and it's 8 basis points in pricing. So just simple math, it gets us at 240,000 is what the record keeper receives for core record keeping. No loans, no quadros, no a la carte services, right? And we get to a cost of $48 per participant, okay? So for this slide and the next couple slides, let's assume that there was an RFP for record keeping services done. There was a benchmark. There was something to say, this is an appropriate cost per participant for this plan, for the services rendered at $48 per participant, okay? Now, in each subsequent year, the assets grow by 10%. Obviously, hypothetical, market swings, participant changes, but notice that the participant count stays the same. Whether this is realistic or not, I'm trying to illustrate a point, but assets go up by 10%. So in year 2, in year 2021, the advisor and the plan sponsor says, well, we just did an RFP. We don't necessarily need to go back to the record keeper and try to squeeze them for, a lower fee. And obviously the cost for record keeping, since assets have gone up by 10%, the total record keeping cost went up by 10% because it's priced on an asset-based fee. And the cost per participant went up by 10%. It went up $4.80. So if $48 per participant is fair, well, now the participants are overpaying by 10%. Now let's skip financial models, and those of you that are record keepers, I understand that, stick with me on the principle. So what happens here in 2022? Now plan assets have grown by 20%, and the record keeper proactively offers a 1 basis point drop in record keeping pricing. Plan sponsor high fives itself. The advisor is like, yeah, we got a fee reduction, but let's look at what really happened here. We went from $48 per participant to $50.82 per participant. I think y'all can see as we go along here, even though there's a reduction in basis point pricing for record keeping, we go from 8 to 7 to 6. The trend in cost per participant for the same services has gone from $48 per participant to almost $58 per participant. So in this 6-year period, there's $150,000 overage in record keeping fees paid to the record keeper. Okay. The illustration here is when you're doing your benchmarks, most of those services, including the one that I use, the one that I subscribe to, presents record keeping benchmarks in terms of basis points, in terms of asset-based fees compared to other plans, all right? So the illustration here is even though you feel and you think you got a reduction in basis points or reduction in record keeping fees, you actually didn't. So I'm going to change the slide here, and the only difference is we're going to go from 5,000 participants to 4,000 participants, right? And if 8 basis points was fair, $48 per participant is fair. Well, which one is it? Let's go to, so I just changed slides. It looks the same, but notice the title says same assets, lower participant count. So there's 4,000 participants. It's still 8 basis points, but instead of $48 per participant, which we thought was an appropriate amount, we're paying $60 per participant. So advisors, when you benchmark and you present record keeping to your plan sponsor, you need to look at both basis points and the cost per participant. And my last slide is, well, here's what happens in the original case where we had 5,000 participants and nothing ever happened, right? There's no proactive action by the plan or the advisor where it stays at 8 basis points, and basically there's $400,000 of overage, right? And if we turn this from a $300 million plan to a $3 billion plan, that's $4 million of overage in 6 years, which is what class action periods typically run 6-7 years. So here's some information from an NEPC study done in 2020. And I'll define what each of these terms mean. But in 2020, 63% of these plans for this NEPC study said their record keeping was priced on a fixed dollar amount. This is the amount per head. And what I'm seeing is that is the trend to go to fixed dollar. Now, a disclaimer, or whether we talk about, hey, this is what was in the survey, the average size of these plans were above $500 million. These were larger plans. So just to complete this for you, let me describe what bundled means and what fixed basis points, and I'm not sure what other means, probably some hybrid arrangements. A bundled arrangement in this study, not necessarily that all fees were bundled. Bundled meant they assumed that everything was paid by revenue share. So whether revenue share was even across the board or we had different funds with different revenue share arrangements, 16% of these plans in 2020 used revenue share. So whether or not there was fee levelization, whether all the revenue share was the same, but those 16% of plans use some form of revenue share, the fixed basis points assumes there was no revenue share with an asset-based fee added on, meaning, right, all of the participants paid on a pro rata share, but 63% of record keeping was paid on a flat fee basis. So let me put a ribbon around how record keeping pricing should be done. I already mentioned this first bullet point. For some record keeping.
Just to chime in, Nevin had a comment. So you buy the argument, pun acknowledged, that record keeper service is appropriately costed at per participant basis is a comment made there. And I can repeat that.
So there's so the question is, you buy the argument, pun acknowledged, the record keeping services are appropriately priced on a per participant basis, okay? So here's my comment on that. And it's interesting I get this question because I got a very similar question from my lunch talk today from one of the attendees there. I am a fan, Eric Dyson's opinion, and not my expert opinion in expert lawsuits, right? But I like to see it on a per participant basis. And the reason I present that is, my thought is that if somebody has a balance of $250,000 compared to somebody who has a balance of $5,000, they are still receiving the same service, okay? They have the same website, they have the same participant services, they have the same process and fee for doing loans, which, okay, that's a la carte, different discussions. Now, that's my individual opinion, but I want to add on to it, and we'll get to this in a couple slides. The Department of Labor clearly says that plan sponsors have wide discretion in how they make this decision. It's just important that they come up with a reason as to why they did it, okay? So yes, I like to see it, and I have seen some class action cases. These are obviously larger plans. And one of them was the MIT case, where a non-monetary action required by the plan sponsor was they had to do a record-keeping RFP, and they had to get the bids on a per-head basis. That was a requirement of the court decision, okay? So little just addition onto that. Another thing to be aware, that your initial record-keeping price proposal could show a disparity between your per-head and your asset-based fee quote. Well, what do I mean by that? I mentioned, right, record keepers have financial models. They have actuaries that are figuring out, well, what do we need to, cover our business expenses, have a little bit of a margin, which that's okay if they're giving the right service. But if their financial model assumes that the plan assets are going to grow, then maybe the asset-based fee quote might be a lower amount compared to a per head quote, right? Because if it's a per head quote and assets grow, that record keeper isn't going to get any more revenue. If it's an asset-based fee quote, then the record keeper and their financial models assume that there will be growth in the assets and growth in their revenue, okay? And we've already been over for benchmarking services. Many third-party benchmarking services will give you only an asset-based record-keeping, let's call it a peer group, and you need to be careful how you handle that. All right, frequency of RFPs. Note the question. How often are your clients actually performing service provider RFPs? Is it more often than every 3 years? And why do I have every 3 to 5 years in italics, a different color and underlines? That's the buzzword that we all use, right? You should do it every 3 to 5 years, and we'll talk about where that comes from, what the reference document is, and what the DOL says about that. Is it every 5 to 10 years? Are they doing it 10 years or more, or not at all? Okay. So I've lost track of the number of times I've been asked by opposing counsel in a deposition, well, Mr. Dyson, were all of your clients doing an RFP for record keeper advisor services every 3 to 5 years? And my response is very easy. Well, not all of my clients did everything that I recommended, right? So you as advisors, I understand that you're recommending these actions, and your advisors may not be, your clients may not be acting on it. But nowhere in legislation or ERISA does it say you should do an RFP at appropriate intervals, unless you have other things that are taking a priority, unless you have to worry about your healthcare renewal, unless there's a global pandemic, right? There are not exceptions that say, hey, you don't have to do this if you have better things to do. So next question, and again, this was going to be a polling question, how often are you and your clients actually engaging in a provider benchmark? Is it every year, every other year, every 3 years? Not at all. And I'll just remind you as advisors, you need to own this process. The conundrum of this, if you're an advisor and benchmarking your own services, okay, I strongly suggest that you do that, but somehow along the way, you have to suggest to your plan or somehow the same standard by which you're suggesting record keeping services, okay? I've been approached by a couple advisors, and I think I saw a couple of their names pop up on the call that, hey Eric, this is the status with this client, but I think I need an independent benchmark that Eric might be able to help out with. And I applaud those advisors for saying, hey, not just because they came to me, but they're saying, hey, I'm going to look at an independent source to do this benchmark, all right? How often is necessary? Can you only do benchmarks and not do an RFP? What is DOL guidance? Where do 5 years come from? Let's talk about how often is necessary. If plan sponsor writes a check for all third-party services, then really it's less pressing that you evaluate the cost of services because the plan sponsor is writing a check for them. But there's a service. Can you just do benchmarks and not do an RFP? I'm going to give you my opinion, and then I'll tell you what I've seen in class action litigation, all right? With no specific case in mind, just, keeping those confidential. I still think you'd need to do a competitive bid at a regular interval. I didn't say RFP, right? If you just as an advisor, you go to a couple record keepers and you say, hey, how would you quote this plan? Something more than an RFI, right? The competitive situation is what makes it so the incumbent record keeper, and this is the same for you as an advisor, has to say, hey, this is the service and cost structure, we're willing to live with that. My opinion is that should be done every 3 to 5 years. I can tell you, I've seen litigation, don't necessarily agree with this, but if there's been benchmarks at appropriate intervals and the plan somehow negotiated a lower fee structure for the party in litigation, those have survived to say, well, there was a reduction in fee, there was a benchmark. Go back to my continuum of, hey, what's the fiduciary requirement versus what's best practices? I've suggested that best practices every 3 to 5 years. So what is DOL guidance? And where does every 3 to 5 years come from? Let's start with where does every 3 to 5 years come from? It actually comes from the original 408B2 documentation. All right, so advisors, you need to take that and know it, and you can present that to your clients. And what it says is the Department of Labor assumes that plans do an RFP for third-party service providers at a minimum of every 3 to 5 years. That is the exact language. The Department of Labor assumes, all right? So what is presented to me in depositions, well, Mr. Dyson, wouldn't you agree that that does not say the Department of Labor requires an RFP every 3 to 5 years? I agree, that it doesn't have that requirement. DOL guidance is that you make sure that your cost is commensurate with the service provided. Now you know where every 3 to 5 years comes from, and I'm just looking at my time here. I want to press on. What is guidance? for how are fees paid by plan participants. I'm going a little more quickly through this than I would hope because of looking at time, but Field Assistance Bulletin 2003-03, as advisors, you would be well served to find this, and probably what I'm presenting in the slides here are all you need to highlight in. ERISA contains no provision that specifically addresses how plan expenses may be allocated. That's kind of the opening of this Field Assistance Bulletin. It doesn't say this is how you shall or how you're supposed to, or nowhere in ERISA does it say how plan expenses should be allocated. But the purpose for this Field Assistance Bulletin is to give some clarification. So accordingly, plan sponsors and fiduciary have considerable discretion, and I've given you that phrase a couple of times. But here is the but. Plan fiduciary must be prudent in the selection of the method of allocation, and at a minimum requires a process. So here's a case that I gave opinion on, was that roughly, and I'm changing the numbers just a little bit, but it still applies, roughly 50% of the plan assets were in target date funds, which was the QDIA. And roughly 85% of the revenue share came from the target date funds. And my opinion was that it was not correct to take 85% of the revenue from the plan participants who were defaulted into an option, all right? Now, the court didn't find a whole lot of weight in that because it really didn't violate any principle of reference, but in my opinion was that, and I think you would have advised us, if you find a plan where hey, 50% of the assets are paying 85% of the revenue share, you would say that we need a better process. So here's on the other hand, and this is what I referenced in the same court case, that if the method of allocation does not have a reasonable relationship to the services furnished, and I said that 50% of assets were not getting 85% of the services. All right, a case may, it doesn't say a case can be, is made, but case may be made that a fiduciary breached their fiduciary duties. All right, just I'm looking at the time and I want to move forward here for Mike, and we may go just a little bit over the hour for you. I should have stick around, but let me hand it over to Mike to move on to the business operations segment of what we're going to discuss. Mike.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. I just asked for the control of the presentation. I don't see it yet.
Yeah, give us a second, folks, and take us a second to hand it over to Mike. Otherwise, I'll be clicking through the slides. One of the challenges that came up were in two different locations, which we didn't quite plan today.
No.
All right, I'll just have to click through, Mike. And
There we
have
go.
to ask me.
All right. So we're going to go through client segmentation today. And this is a practice, and we're going to give you the construct for this practice. But this is a practice that you should be running across your business. And what I see as I'm out there talking to advisors, both on the wealth management side as well as the 401k advisor side, is that people aren't doing this effectively or aren't doing it often enough if they're doing it at all. And so as you look at our business, this is a scale, focus, and efficiency business. And we're all battling margin compression. And margin compression comes in two flavors. One is that our clients beat us down on price, but the other one is that our clients ask us to deliver more services for the same price. And the reason that creates margin compression, it takes our teams, our service teams and others, more time and time allocation to service that client now. And we may not have adjusted our pricing. So in this, what we're going to go through as the construct about understanding how to evaluate the book of business overall is looking at pricing, looking at the time allocation, and looking at your service models. And so since all of you have different ways of pricing and service models and different sizes of teams, you'll see that some of this is generic so that you can construct this yourself. Next slide. So why is this important? It's important to help you to create your strategy, your focus, and your consistency from the standpoint of process. And creating those consistent standard processes for your teams. It's from the standpoint of target marketing and targeting the right clients that do drive the types of revenue and the margin that you want. It helps you from the standpoint of getting the right clients from cross-selling and gaining referrals, but also increasing your profitability overall. Next slide. I'm sorry, you guys are going to have to hear me say next slide all the time here. I apologize. But if you take a look at hours, and through some study and through experience, what we see is about with dealing with a client, that your average employee will spend 2 to 5 hours per week dealing with a client. And a service representative can handle about 15 to 25 clients effectively. And as you look at this in the hours and you look at the time and the effort and the service models and the pricing, to put this in perspective, if you look at that over a year and you say that the average client is going to get 5 hours of service a week, you take that across the 25 clients, and then you take it by 50 weeks, because say your employees take 2 weeks of vacation, that to service a client for 5 hours per week and deliver that across the base of 25 clients, it's going to take you about 3 employees, because that's going to be about 6,250 hours in total during the year. And so this is something that you have to look at, something you have to evaluate, and something you have to consider and analyze as to how you are spending your resources on your clients, and which services are of value to your clients and which ones may not be as much value, but still take your time. Next slide. Now, if you look at how hours are spent by the typical financial advisor across various weekly tasks, what you see are a number of different tasks: business development, professional development, planning and analysis, investment management, and other tasks of managing the people, client service tasks, administrative tasks, meeting prep, and meeting with current clients. What you'll see is this direct client activity is broken out into a separate pie chart. But if you focus in here, you see that the average advisor is spending about 9 hours a week in sales. And most of us, what we do best is we sell, and we give great customer service. And that's how we've grown our practices. And that's where we work in the business. What this client segmentation is going to do is help us to work on the business. So helping to grow that business and grow it profitably. So if you look at business development, spending about 9% of our time in business development, the one that's really lacking is the professional development. We're spending about 3.2 hours a week on professional development. In fact, there were some people who actually responded to me about Retirement Ace and said, "Hey, I can't afford to do this, 2 hours a month." And my response back to them was, you can't afford not to. Because here again, we look at this where professional development is about 3.2 hours a week. And this is where we need to spend more time. And this is where Retirement Ace can help. Next slide. Now, something all of us have to look at is, how are we charging our clients? Do we know our profitability by client hour? Do we know our target profitability by client segment? What's that margin that we're shooting for, that we want to attain? Do we know what the profitability is by service offering? So each of those services we're delivering, whether it's a 338 service, whether it's fiduciary risk mitigation, whether it's participant education and ongoing wellness, how much are we truly charging for those, and are we profitable with those charges? Next slide. So as we look at this and we look at the price and the service standards, and keep in mind, as you look at ERISA and other, it's not just price, it's price plus service that equals what is allowed. And so we have to always work toward taking our pricing and connecting with our service models and making sure that these are reasonable, because that's what it's all about, is the reasonableness. Something else we have to do, we have to look at like clients, and we'll get into this in a minute, but look at like clients by size and by services. And are we charging those clients the same, or are we charging them differently? And is that a potential risk for us as advisors? So when you look at this, how do you charge? Is it asset-based commission? Is it fee for service? Is it fee only? Is it some combination? And this is what Eric went over before. And then we get into, what is our differentiation in the market? What is it that we truly deliver to our clients? Is it the fiduciary risk mitigation processes and review? Is it benchmarking? Is it investment services such as 321 and 338, and also delivering investment monitoring reports? Is it participant services such as enrollment, education, financial planning, financial wellness? Is it overall plan management, managing the other providers? Is it quarterly meetings or semi-annual meetings, or does that vary by client? But these are all things that we have to consider and look at as we go through this segmentation process. Next slide. Now, looking at financial advisors and how they typically charge, for assets under management, AUM, it's usually 25 to 50 basis points, and that does include the robo-advisor component. Look at flat fee retainer pricing, and it's generally $2,000 to $7,500. We look at hourly fees, and it's $200 to $400 an hour. And we look at flat fee services by product or by delivery of the service at $5,000 to $10,000 per. Now, that hourly one is where the industry is starting to focus, is getting down to how much we are actually making per hour and how much we're charging per hour on the client base through our employees. Next slide. So this is a client mapping, and this is how you will start to do your segmentation. And we can help you with this because it is an in-depth process, and it does take time, and it does take focus. But you can, number one is you need to stack rank your clients. Now, you can stack rank them by assets, by number of participants, by service offerings, or by revenues. And as you go through this process, you may start with one and then do a second cut with using another one to stack rank. From there, it'll be the estimated hours that your team, and the team is those individuals that are working with that client. Is it one person? Is it three people? Is it five? But taking all that into consideration, the estimate of hours, and it's going to be an estimate because you haven't truly tracked hours yet. And that's a process we will get into on another session with Retirement Ace, is a process and protocol for tracking the hours. Then you take the salaries of the individuals, you do that on a pro rata basis as to the hours, and then you determine the consistency or pricing by like clients. So if you have two clients, for example, where one of them has $5 million of assets, 150 employees, and you're charging them $25,000. You have another client with the $5 million in assets, 200 employees, same service model, but you charge them $50,000. You know, looking at this consistency is also looking at managing your risk. And if you are charging somebody more that is a similar client, why is it? What is different? How can you explain that or defend it? From there, then you calculate your hourly profit and loss. Now, the next slide. The next slide is a brief layout of the way you do this. So, because everybody has different revenue models, different hour estimates and things, I didn't fill those in here. But going through and showing you a stack ranking here by the assets, by the number of participants, by service offerings, and then filling out the rest of the chart. When you do this, you then find where you have commonalities and where you have outliers. And you will start to see where you are on this calculating the hourly profit or loss by client. And this is where you're going to find what your margin is, where you want to be with your margin by client. Next slide. Now, as you do this, there is another step that you have to look at, and that is the challenging and difficult clients. So as you slice and dice your clients into the segments, you're going to do this brackets by assets, brackets by revenues, brackets by service model, but then by your challenging clients. And here's why this is so important. All of us deal with some clients who are over the top and challenging to the team. And you've got to make a business decision as to how valuable this client truly is by the revenue and by their profit margin, as to how much you're going to allow them to upset your team and, quite frankly, hurt team morale. We see this in all of our offices where we've got a certain client, when they call, they upset an employee. And so you got to determine how much that's really worth to you. Coaching the employees through it, of course, but find out how those challenging clients affect overall morale of your team, because morale affects productivity. And this is about getting, again, to not only profitability, but productivity. Next slide. So as you create your margins by target per client segment, you're going to then weed out what we call the outliers. And with the outliers, you've got options. Next slide. So, next slide, sorry. As you determine these outliers, the questions are, how do you want to handle them? What do you want to do with them? So one is do nothing and just keep the revenue coming, keep servicing the clients, and nothing changes. Another one is, as you look at your outliers on the lower end of your margin scale, is do you want to increase the pricing on them? On your smaller startup clients, you want to go with a flat fee, and maybe it's a higher flat fee than what you've been charging. If you look at a block of clients that say are either large or small and outside of your market, your target market, do you want to sell those off to another advisor? Or do you want to create a partnership with an advisor? One who maybe is a small market advisor and you're a medium to large market advisor. And then you exchange leads amongst each other as well as client base. Or do you want to terminate those clients and give them 90 days to find another advisor, even help them to find another advisor? These are all options and things that as you run your business, as you grow your business, and as you move your business toward greater profitability and margin, as well as efficiency and effectiveness, these are tough decisions that you have to make. Now, you can always say, I'm not going to make any decision. I'm just going to keep running it as it is. And that's great. That's a decision. But does that help you to change, evolve, and escalate your business? Because as we look at this with the segmentation of the clients, you should run a segmentation like this of your client block about once every 3 years. And you should do this from the standpoint of your business growth. I'm sure everybody on this call has a different business model today than they did 3 to 5 years ago. I'm sure they have a different asset base than they did 3 to 5 years ago, and a total participant base or individual client base than they did 3 to 5 years ago. This business has been in growth mode. And so with that, all of these businesses have evolved. And so doing this client segmentation will help you to evolve your focus with your clients, with your service, with your processes, your standards, and with your profitability. Next slide. And with this is going to help with everything that I just said. But in addition to this, with the next steps, some of the things that we're going to talk about are how to actually create the hourly tracking for employees and that employee base, and what processes and standards to put in from the standpoint of your actual service offerings to your clients. So those will be the next steps with Retirement Ace on the practice management side. Eric?
So that's the end of the curriculum. We got a couple things to wrap up here. We'll tell you what's next for Retirement Ace, what's next for you. And as asked, please, we got just a couple of polling questions that help us out with what would make it better for you. And just remember, hey, I'm going to go back to the proverb. Where are we going to go for them, and what's the next steps?
Yeah, well, one thing that came through the questions was might be nice to split independents from aggregators. So that's an interesting comment. So thank you for that comment, whoever that was. From here, what we're going to do is we're going to send out the recording from today's session. And then we're also going to send you some information so that we can talk about how we proceed with you and make you a part of the group going forward. With that, really appreciate everybody's time. I know it went a little bit longer than we had originally thought or expected, but thank you guys for hanging in there. Hope you found it to be of great value, and look forward to carrying on with you in the months to come.
Nevin, thanks for all your input in the Q&A.